We all depend on resilient infrastructure, yet today's infrastructure is highly exposed and vulnerable to a number of complex hazards, posing extreme risks to critical assets and its services. For example, in 2019, Cyclone Idai caused over $1.4 billion worth of damage in Mozambique, with significant damage to the transport network, health facilities, homes, schools, and other critical infrastructure. We need to adopt a net resilience gain approach, similar to that of net zero, in addressing today's investment into future infrastructure. The 6 interconnected principles for resilient infrastructure are designed to help infrastructure stakeholders to build resilience of infrastructure and meet the goals of the Sendai Framework and Goal 9 of Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and beyond. Principle 1, continuously learning, is about testing and analyzing to find ways to increase the resilience of infrastructure. For example, UNDRR's Resilient Infrastructure Stress Test tool is helping decision makers identify vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, supporting the identification of priorities for action, investment, and continuous improvement. Also, in Sierra Leone, West Africa, the data on public mobility is being collected and analyzed to better understand the road's vulnerability to floods and landslides. Principle 2, proactively protected, ensures that infrastructure is designed and operated to increase resilience to future hazards. For example, in Durban, South Africa, stormwater and drainage infrastructure has been integrated to address an estimated 15% increase in rainfall by 2065. Principle 3, environmentally integrated, helps find nature-based solutions to minimize environmental harm. For example, green roofs provide weather protection while improving air quality and saving energy. While in Mexico and Cuba, coral reefs provide flood protection as well as enhancing biodiversity. Principle 4, socially engaged, is about encouraging community participation to help keep infrastructure resilient. For example, Japan is managing to avoid non-essential energy use during severe earthquakes by working with society to encourage non-essential demand to be removed, thereby prioritizing limited supply of power to where it is needed. Principle 5, shared responsibility, is about bringing together stakeholders across all sectors and organizations to build trust and accountability through the use of standards and the clear allocation of roles and responsibilities by encouraging a cooperative approach to management and planning. For example, the FAIR principles for data sharing of the Virus Outbreak Data Network, VODAN, Africa could be adopted to facilitate and encourage the sharing of data between organizations. Principle 6, adaptively transforming, focuses on creating adaptive capacity in all stages of resilience. For example, in Indonesia, adaptive capacity has been created by looking for opportunities at the water-food-energy nexus. With a focus on increasing water security, a flexible approach to land use has been adopted by using integrative planning tools such as Lumen's land use for multiple environmental services to promote resilient agroforestry solutions. To build truly resilient infrastructure that will protect our communities and achieve a collaborative commitment to net resilience gain, we need governments, investors, planners, service providers, the private sector, and the public stakeholders to work together to implement the principles for resilient infrastructure.
A very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to very warmly welcome you to the 11th thematic sessions of the 2022 Global Platform for Risk Reduction. This afternoon, we will be talking about how we build a better future by investing in resilient infrastructure for all. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to not just those who are here in the hall today, but also those who are joining us virtually. In the last 10 years or so, before that, let me introduce myself. I am Kamal Kishore. I'm a member of India's National Disaster Management Authority. I am also a co-chair of the Executive Committee of the Global Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. In the last 10 years or so, the whole notion of resilient infrastructure has gained a lot of traction. When we talk about moving beyond lives to saving livelihoods, protecting infrastructure is absolutely critical. If we do well in target D of Sendai framework, which is protecting disruptions emerging from damage to critical infrastructure, we will be able to achieve target A, B, and C as well in terms of reducing loss of lives, reducing number of people affected, reducing economic losses. So it's really, in a sense, target D in some senses is a keystone target. You know, if you do well there, you do well everywhere else as well. So this whole thing has gained a lot of traction. In the last session, we heard about systemic resilience, and systemic resilience cannot be achieved unless we really invest in resilient infrastructure systems. It's an issue not just for developing countries that are building large infrastructure that suffer from huge infrastructure deficits. It's also an issue for countries where advanced economies, where infrastructure is completing its life cycle and needs to be replaced. So it's a concern which is common to both developed and developing countries, small island states, landlocked states, and so on. So while this whole notion of resilient infrastructure has gained traction, what do we mean by resilient infrastructure? And that's where you saw the video, the work that UNDRR is through extensive consultations with the generous support of the government of Qatar, is breaking new ground. We have now 6 principles that must underpin the movement towards investment in resilient infrastructure. You've seen that if we apply these 6 principles, then we can begin to design systems which are adaptively transformative, where we look at infrastructure systems in an integrated way, look at gray and green infrastructure together, infrastructure systems which are people-oriented and hence are socially engaged, infrastructure systems which continuously learn and upgrade themselves, infrastructure systems that are seen not as run by some narrow authorities, but a shared responsibilities, infrastructure investments that are de-risked because they are informed by sophisticated risk assessments. So these are 6 principles which will help us realize the notion of resilient infrastructure and put them into implementation. We also have an initiative, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, with 30 countries and 8 international organizations as part of it. 3 weeks ago, we concluded our 4th international conference on disaster resilient infrastructure, which dwelt on many of these issues. In the next 15 years, from 2025 to 40 or so, we expect, depending on whose numbers you look at, 80 to 100 trillion dollars of investments expected in building infrastructure. This is a huge challenge, but this is also a huge opportunity. It's a challenge because the rate at which we are building infrastructure, our systems and processes, how we apply the 6 principles that we talked about, really have to keep pace with the pace at which infrastructure is being built. So that's a challenge, but the opportunity is that, there are estimates that the infrastructure that the world will have by 50, half of it is yet to build. So we have the opportunity to really get it right. And as they say, for the future, we can lock in resilience as opposed to risk. And that really is with the theme of this year's GPDRR, From Risk to Resilience. With that, we have a very distinguished panel, from across the world, from Africa, Arab states, Europe. We have private sector representation. We will have a very engaging conversation this afternoon. But before we start that, here are some housekeeping matters that I would like to highlight. If you're watching this online and you wish to follow this session in any of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of your video window. It is very important that you mute the audio from the video player. I'll hear the original language plus the interpretation. There is a short video on the reception page of the platform that explains how to do this. We will have a question and answer session where we'll use, like for earlier in this conference, Slido will be used for the Q&A during this session. In-room participants you can connect on slido.com using your mobile phones and insert the code that is shown on the room screen. You can see it on the screen behind me. For those following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Polls and Q&A on the right-hand side of the menu. If you are in the room and are unable to use Slido, please raise your hand and the in-room support staff will assist you. If you are in Hopin and are unable to use the Polls and Q&A tab or any other Hopin feature, please contact the online support team via the chat box. So without further ado, let's hear from our distinguished panelists. We will have 2 opening questions that I would like to pose. In response to that, I will invite each of the panelists, my fellow panelists this afternoon, to make a brief intervention of 3 to 4 minutes. So the 2 questions are as follows. Number 1, how adequate our efforts have been to date to realize the target D of the Sendai framework? And to remind us what target D is, the target D is to substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure by 2030. So how adequate our efforts have been to achieve target D? And the second is, what are the opportunities to build the resilience of infrastructure, taking into account transition risks? As you know, the infrastructure systems, the energy systems, transportation systems, they are transitioning at a very rapid pace. So what are the opportunities that whole transition process provides? So with that, may I invite the Honorable Minister to my right, Honorable Minister from Uganda, Honorable Esther Anayakun. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator. On the key guidelines on principle for resilience, on the context of today, urban development, it's critical to have a firm basis of physical infrastructure, and that seeks to achieve resilience under the changing climatic environment. Some of the principles we bring, for example, the issue of risks. It's very, very important to take into account the possibility threat surrounding development and activities. In order to eliminate risks, it is also very important to identify the causes and address the risks responsibly. The government has an obligation to protect its citizens against risks. It is also, therefore, possible to see risk management or building resilience as a public goods similar to physical infrastructure. The second one is on the issue of land use planning. Uganda had the whole country planning area under the Physical Planning Act 2010 and amended it again in 2020. The land use plans influence the location, design, timing of the development plans, and then land use plans and special action areas plans inform physical development plans. This includes the infrastructure, which is prepared and also adapted prior to the development of the land. The risk-based land use planning is useful in identifying the safest areas of priorities to prioritize the development and infrastructure project. And mainstreaming land use planning in infrastructure projects is critical in reducing systematic and everyday risks in the built environment, as well as where the hazard areas are prone. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Can we now hear from Ms. Beate Zanovic from Poland? Your perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Beata Janowczyk from Poland, from the Government Center for Security. My perspective, you know, in the changing world, it's difficult to say about my perspectives. But of course, first of all, I'd like to express my appreciation for work done on the principles of resilience infrastructure. As a Polish, because I'm also a national focal point for Sendai framework, and on the other hand, a National Crisis Management Center. That's why, for my point of view, we really welcome this initiative, and I'm sure this document will be a significant base to build resilience infrastructure. Why? Because we need to improve the continuity of critical systems as, for example, energy, transport, or water supply. What's more, regarding the opportunities to build the resilience of infrastructure, the administration should learn from experience. What doesn't mean that, as I mentioned before, the new challenges like pandemic, cyber attacks, migration crisis, or Russian aggression on Ukraine that we faced during the recent years have indicated that vertical approach in crisis, in critical infrastructure, and that this is not enough capability. Yeah? That's for it is important to correctly identify, understand, analyze, and draw some conclusion from new challenges in order to implement practical measures to build resilience infrastructure.
Thank you very much. I think the first two interventions gave us something to chew upon. Honorable Minister, your emphasis that unless you do risk-based land use planning, it will be very difficult to pursue the notion of disaster and climate resilient infrastructure, continuously learning from what's happening in our systems, how do we continuously adapt, and that aligns with the principles that were presented earlier. So next, let me turn to Dr. Dena Asaf. She is the UN Resident Coordinator in UAE.
Do I need to touch anything? No, it's on? Oh, okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Glad to be here today. I want to speak directly to the questions you asked. You first asked whether there's been adequate response. And I was thinking to myself, I said, well, we wouldn't be here today and have this conference if there was adequate response. So I think we know the answer to that one. Being in the United Nations, of course, across the world, the challenges that are being faced by lack of resilience and prevention. And we speak to opportunities. And when we speak to opportunities, again, I want to speak to today's very important gathering, where awareness raising and advocacy become key as part of the learning process for all to be involved, for people to know what their role could be. So as the Honorable Minister mentioned, planning is key. And as we look at the evolution of time, we know we have to be able to innovate and adapt to new technologies and integrate them into our systems. We also need to make sure that prevention is not an afterthought, but part of and parcel of our planning and our work. And additionally, once we've created whatever we've created, we need to maintain it. We don't create something and forget it, expect it to take care of itself. And I think this is part of the challenge that we face across the world, where, let's say, lesser cost alternatives are sought, not knowing or not realizing, and again, where the awareness comes in, that these shortcuts lead to greater cost in the long run. So maintenance should be integrated into the overall policy. And finally, I'll just conclude with saying, as an introduction statement, since we all know that the Sustainable Development Goals are core to our thinking over this next decade, that this is an integrated approach. When we talk about the resilience and prevention and infrastructure, we need to look at all aspects of the SDGs and how this integrates into that. Otherwise, we will find ourselves in other challenges along the way. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, UNRC from UAE. You presented a quotable quote: "The shortcuts are expensive in the long run." I think that's really important, that when we look at infrastructure costs, we really have to look at those over the life cycle of the infrastructure. So it's not just good planning, design, implementation in the beginning, but also the way infrastructure systems are maintained and operated has to be underpinned by principles of resilience and pursuing these things in an integrated way. So let's hear a private sector perspective on this issue from Engineer Hossam El-Gamal. He is the chair or co-chair of Arise Egypt, and he has joined us virtually. Engineer Hossam El-Gamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I take this opportunity to thank you for the event, and also I want to read that disaster risk recovery is good.
We can hear you.
Yes, I think. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was saying is first to thank you for the session, and then reiterating the fact that disaster risk recovery is good, but risk mitigation and resilience is extremely important, and it proved to be such important during the pandemic period. In fact, for us in private sector, not just achieving the target D of the Sendai framework, but also help economic growth, which is very important for all developing countries and for all private sector as such. Now, based on the slide in front of the investment that was implemented in Egypt to achieve resilience in different elements. So we had many unsafe areas, and 63 billion Egyptian pounds were spent during the last few years to develop 357 unsafe areas. So now we do not have any unsafe areas, and this was extremely important to achieve resilience, risk mitigation, and also opportunity of work in building, replacing places for those people. Similarly, 318 billion Egyptian pounds were invested in the efficiency of the infrastructure of the unplanned areas, so not to have again unsafe areas. And those investments were spent and invested in work for people, for private sector to work, and for economic growth as well. So we are achieving both and at the same time. As you can see here, at least for Egypt, there was a clear plan to cover different resilient areas. So unsafe areas, roads, energy projects, national network for emergency public safety, enhancing ICT infrastructure, even connecting with fiber optics all government buildings, just to make sure that we are able at all time to respond properly and to maintain a good economic system as such. So just to confirm again, resilience is extremely important. For us, it helped us a lot during the pandemic because when we have put those investment prior to this, we were able to manage better the pandemic period with minimal impact and maintaining a good growth of 5% yearly for last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Al-Gamal. We were not able to hear you very clearly, but the slide was an important and useful anchor. So the landscape of issues that you touched upon from the Egypt experience was very useful, ranging from safe housing to safe road networks to looking at resilience of energy systems, not just the traditional systems, but also renewable energy systems, also resilience of ICT infrastructure. You know, the world has been able to somehow survive the pandemic on the back of the ICT infrastructure, and we can't take its resilience for granted. So thank you for framing those things within the context of your experience in Egypt. Let's turn to another private sector colleague, Mr. Rob Wesseling. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So yes, I am from the private sector, from the insurance industry, actually, financial services more broadly, and from the cooperative sector as well, where I've spent the majority of my career. So my comments will certainly be colored by those experiences. So with respect to the first question, you know, have we done a good enough job? Have we done an adequate job in building resilient infrastructure? I think the answer to that question is quite clearly no. You can see a slide here. I won't go in an immense amount of detail. I'll reference that it's from Swiss Re, so it is an insurance view. And I'd like you to focus on the red line. And what the red line represents is the difference between the total losses from natural disasters over time as compared to those losses that were insured. And so you can see that the line is increasing quite dramatically, actually, over the time period. It continues to increase. And this is occurring even though the insurance markets globally are increasing as well. So there's more insurance available. But even with that additional coverage in place, this protection gap is increasing. And so what is that gap? That gap is the gap in resiliency. So, you know, we are not effectively on a global basis protecting our homes or businesses or critical infrastructure the way that we could, well, the way that we must. Still, from an insurance perspective, you know, as that gap increases, it actually creates a significant risk for the industry, and one that you might not expect. And you shouldn't worry about, you know, about the industry all that much, but I think it's telling in terms of the challenges that we will all face as a society as a result of it. As that gap increases, the relevance of insurance decreases because we're responding to less of the disasters, and our products become less and less affordable as a result of that as well. And so in response to the first question, there's much more that we need to do. What is heartening is that, you know, the 80 to 100 trillion dollars of infrastructure that is going to be built over the next 15 years or so, we have a real opportunity to protect not just the infrastructure itself, but lives, livelihoods, and to reduce this protection gap as a result of that over time. The downside here is that even if we hit all of our targets. So even if we hit our net zero targets, even if we accomplish the Paris Accord targets, there is a certain amount of increased physical risk that is already locked in because of the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere and the carbon that we'll continue to put into the atmosphere up until 2050, assuming that we're successful in hitting the targets. And so this challenge is going to certainly increase. So that's a very long way of saying, the response to question one is no, we haven't done enough. We have a lot of work to do. The second part of the question was about transition risk, and if there are ways that we could think about building resilient infrastructure so that it would take advantage of transition as well. And I'll share two things here. One is transition risks and physical risks are very much interrelated and correlated. And so, when you think about a sunset industry, when you think about a piece of infrastructure that won't be needed in the future because our transportation system will change or water systems will change, as an example, they can be very correlated because a catastrophic event that is close to the end of the life of that piece of infrastructure may actually render it obsolete earlier than we intended. And that leads to the second element, which is around prioritization. We should absolutely seek to build for our infrastructure for the long term, and assuming that we're going to have increased physical risks in the future than those that we have now. But the prioritization can come into play if we expect an industry, a piece of infrastructure to be, not to be required 15, 20, 25 years from now. We can deprioritize its protection to some extent, or at least not build to the same level, so that we can build other pieces of infrastructure to a higher level if they will be needed over the long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for those very insightful remarks. The protection gap directly translates into resilience gap. The physical risks and transition risks are interconnected, and in some ways, many of the physical really lock into some of the physical risks. And there's a need, given the new reality, we need to prioritize, and that brings to bear the whole notion of better analytics of risk to inform prioritization in terms of investment in resilience. I think that was a good first round of discussions here. On my first question, whether the world has done enough, the answer is a resounding no. But at the same time, there are glimmers of hope from different corners. There is work on the level of principles that UNDRR presented in the video. There is work we are seeing happening in Egypt. There is renewed recognition of better land use planning to inform investment in resilient infrastructure. With that, let's go on to the next round of questions, and I will invite my colleagues in a slightly different order, where you might want to reflect on how do you see the principles that were presented there. How would these principles change the approach that is presently prevalent? And how do we move towards implementation? So with that, Honorable Minister, you'll have the first word.
Thank you very much. The principles of capability of the land use is key to follow. Building resilience into project cycles. All infrastructure projects go through cycles of identification, design, planning, execution, operation, maintenance. And this also indicators to track the performance of the projects, and resilience need to be carefully formulated and applied. On social resilience, this touches on the capacity of the community to cope with and also adapt to disturbance or in the changes. The resilient community is able to respond to changes or stress in a positive way and also maintain its core functions as a community despite stress and their involvement in essentials to recover the process lost on the assets. I want to give you an example of such an example in my country. Of recent, there was a road construction that was going on, and the government wanted a major road to go through a particular village, but there was this big tree that someone purported that it has holy spirits or family spirits, and if you cut it off, um, they said the government has to do like 1.4 million US dollars to cut the tree. So they gave them 1 week to make sure they prepare themselves that we're going to cut the tree, and they kept bargaining that they wanted 1.4 million shillings. After 1 week, the tree was cut, and they had purported that whoever will cut the tree is going to die. And we are waited for that up to tomorrow, and nobody has died in the Ministry of Work. So these are some of the things we are trying to say. How should people, the community itself, get to maintain this kind of the changes that come in terms of social resilience? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, highlighting, giving that anecdote, and also talking about the need for engaging people, hearing people's voices in infrastructure planning, notion of building resilience at the community level. So, Rob, if I were to ask the same question to you, how do the principles change the prevalent approach, and how do we accelerate implementation? What would you say?
Yeah, thank you. We'll pull up another slide here if we can. And I'll try to use this fairly simple model to give a sense of what we have traditionally done, not in all cases, but in I would argue the majority of cases in our recent history, and then talk about the principles a little bit to share how we might do differently. So if you look at the graph on the right, this is a very simple graphic that talks about resiliency. And so, you have a planning period before a disaster happens. In that planning period, you have the opportunity to build resiliency into whatever system it is that you're focused on. Then the disruption happens, the disaster happens, and you have an absorption period. And during that period, it's really where the the negative impacts are felt at their worst. And then we spend a period of time recovering, and so that's where that reddish area is starting to decline again and go back up to the norm. And then, if things go well, we'll have a period of prosperity after that, where another disaster doesn't occur. Historically, we have spent the majority of our time and effort, I believe, in the recover phase. Certainly, from an insurance perspective, insurance is about recovery. The recovery phase is critically important, but I think we've not spent enough time in the other phases. And if we did so, we would build more resiliency into the system. We would be required to absorb less damage, less loss of life, less loss of livelihoods, etc. And so, how can the principles help us with that? Well, the past process wasn't continuously learning because it was really managing by disaster. The disaster would happen. We would do what we had to do to recover as best we could, but we wouldn't put anything in place necessarily as a result of that to improve in the future. The proactively bid principle is really about that planning phase. It's about understanding that the next disaster is going to happen, and building our defenses, building our infrastructure, planning for that event again, so that the impacts are less severe than they would have been otherwise. The socially engaged principle, I think, is really important here as well, and we've had a few examples of that shared this afternoon already. but if we take that planning period and use it to engage the communities that we're serving, we have a much better opportunity that they themselves will be engaged and take part in their own protection, both before the event happens and then when the event happens as well. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, when we've managed by disaster, we have not given ourselves the opportunity to collaborate broadly across the stakeholders in our society. And the resiliency challenges are often extremely complex. And they're often not a challenge that an industry on their own can solve, that a government on their own can solve, that a community on their own can solve. And so by following these principles, especially the shared responsibility principle, we'll actually have the time ahead of time to collaborate and bring the resources that we have to bear to reduce the impact of the disasters that will inevitably happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for those remarks and connecting your thoughts to the principles, the point that we have to work towards spending more time on improving and planning for the future rather than on recovery, and there are ways to do that. Let's turn to issues related to regulatory and policy changes. So I'll turn to Beata. So what do you see as are some of the key regulatory and policy changes that need to happen in order to promote resilience of infrastructure systems?
Thank you very much. In Poland, we have quite a good organization of critical infrastructure system. What makes our critical infrastructure protection unique? First of all, holistic approach to protection. And what does it mean? It can be said that a facility is safe if 6 areas of security are fully implemented. Those consist of ensuring physical, technical, and personal security, also legal security, then cybersecurity, and business continuity and recovery plans. Those areas are interrelated, and the lack of any element means that the facility is not secured. That is also what is also important, the uniform definition of critical infrastructure, resilience infrastructure, or, for example, critical infrastructure protection, not only at the national level, but international level. Yeah? From my point of view, there is other point. We should use standard about risk assessment, because there is a completely different process to administration and to crisis management operators, and both at the national and international level. What also is important, the multidisciplinary and multi-hazard approach is highly needed. We currently identified 171 critical infrastructure facilities operated by 123 critical infrastructure operators. We are currently in process of identifying critical services due to preparation, the implementation of EU Critical Entity Resilience Directive. There is another challenge required to ensure the resilience of infrastructure. During the preparatory days, I catch one word which has occurred during each session and each presentation. Do you know what I'm thinking about? Maybe somebody? It's cooperation. As I mentioned before, crucial is to improve cooperation between administration and critical infrastructure operators. But maybe we should think about consider also cooperation with the insurance sector, because the experience of flood and white storm in recent years in Poland has shown the importance of data on infrastructure losses. On the other hand, collecting data on disasters allows us to better understand risk. What is more, consolidation of a resilience infrastructure should take into the consideration the changing security environment, as I mentioned before. For example, World Economic Forum this year created Global Risk Report, which highlights areas of risk which will appear in the following years. For example, discovery, climate transition, digital dependence, and also cyber vulnerabilities. And other crises, for example, like or issues like crowding and competition in space. Therefore, legislation in area of crisis in critical infrastructure protection has to take into the consideration new challenges, including hybrid threats, misinformation, disinformation, climate change, and also the war. The legal frame should be linked to financing also, and using different financial insufficient, for example, like tax fees and lower tax. And I think that what is the most important also, we should think much more solidarity, yes? We need solidarity, not only in the case of the resilience in critical infrastructure, but also in building resilience in general. Especially now I'm thinking about Ukraine and people fleeing the war.
Thank you very much for those comments, and there is a lot to ponder over. You started by saying that we need some sort of a common language, common definition about what we mean by critical infrastructure, for example, what is resilience in this context of infrastructure systems. So I just want to highlight that the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is to address that gap by working on a lexicon for disaster resilient infrastructure, and it would be great to engage with all of you and see how we can work towards that common language. The whole issue of standards for uniform risk assessments, how do we streamline multiple actors? You talked about 230 operators looking at 416 services. How do we bring them all together? How do we make all of them a participant in the process of building resilience? How do we have greater cooperation and solidarity? How do we go beyond just physical disaster and climate risks to look at other risks? And you highlighted some of the findings of the global risk report and linking that with financing. So thank you for that. Now let's talk a little bit about financing of infrastructure systems. Countries such as mine have huge infrastructure gap. They are investing massively in infrastructure systems. And across the world, infrastructure developers find it difficult to attract financing for infrastructure in general. So how can we increase? And most of, a lot of it is right now forced, publicly financed infrastructure. How do we make sure that we can encourage greater private sector investment to meet the financing needs of infrastructure systems and then making them resilient to physical disaster and climate risk? So how can we help countries access and leverage more private sector investments to build infrastructure and build it in a resilient fashion. So, Resident Coordinator, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think, of course, this is a very important topic, which is related to the engagement of private sector. The private sector, we know, is the majority of society in the end, in any sector that we work in, and their engagement becomes key. In the United Arab Emirates, where we have a very robust private sector, it's also multinational, given the context of the country. UNDRR has created the ARISE network, which is the private sector network amongst the country dealing with issues related to disaster risk reduction. Now, I mentioned this as one of the means where I said at the beginning, awareness, advocacy is very key. You need ownership from the private sector and engagement within the solutions, and just being asked. Now, within the work that we're doing with the UAE private sector, UNDRR is creating a real estate resilience tool. And this is being developed with the real estate developers, investors, the sector at large, so that they are part of this tool, which will assess, as we were saying up front, the importance of understanding the risks that we need to manage. So by bringing in the private sector as part of the solution, part of the ownership, you are able then to have them be part of the overall decision-making on how to move forward in the country. Additionally, I'd like to add to that the element when you spoke of, in the introduction, we had the resilience principles, the 6 principles, which I like very much, by the way. And to say that we know that solutions are also born through our next generation. And we can't forget the role of youth. And I mention youth because we all know that we are moving into megacities. 2/3 of the planet is expected to be in a city environment, urban environment, by the year 2050, which means the whole issue that we're talking about today around infrastructure becomes even more key. So since we're talking about the future, who's going to be in that future? It's our next generations to come. So when we talk about investment, when we talk about integration, we need to make sure that these principles and other tools that we are developing are integrated into our education system, so that they're integrated within the aspects of learning for the new generation that will be doing this work, so that it is not an after again, but something that is integrated into their way of thinking. So this is why I wanted to stress the element of youth. And finally, I'll just re-emphasize again, because I must, within the role that I have, to say when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, again, across all the Sustainable Development Goals, private sector is engaged. And it's important for us to ensure their engagement. This, again, will increase financing options. There are various investment tools being developed, but they're not enough yet. So I think this dialogue needs more effort. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, UNRC from UAE. I think the engagement with real estate sector is really very important in furthering this agenda. Your point of having private sector as a key partner in co-creating the whole demand for resilient infrastructure systems is really key. Any reflections from you, Rob, on the same issue? How do we increase private investment in building infrastructure and so that it's resilient?
Yes, thank you. I'll start off by saying this is entirely possible. There are already in excess of $130 trillion that are committed to various aspects of net zero, and just from financial institutions globally, the cooperators being one of them. It's an incredible sum of investable assets that can be used in various ways, not just for net zero, but they can also be used to improve the resiliency of our communities as well. I'll come back to that in a moment. So there's a growing desire amongst the private sector to be focused on these issues. The second is that there is a resiliency dividend that is felt by communities when sound, resilient infrastructure is built, and it's felt when the disaster happens because the impacts aren't as great. It doesn't take as long to recover, and as a result of that, the entire community is improved. The challenge with resiliency is that those impacts aren't necessarily on one individual or individual entity's income statement and balance sheet. They're dispersed. And so, the impact is a reduction of risk that impacts private businesses, it impacts individuals and families, it impacts governments, et cetera, et cetera. That's the nut that has to be cracked to make a market like this work, but it's entirely possible. And so let me tell you a little bit about the cooperator's journey to resilient investing. A number of years ago, we started an impact investment portfolio, and we had a goal of getting to 20% of our invested assets in externally verified impact investments by the end of 2022. We're just in excess of that now, so it's 21% of our invested assets. What these investments are doing is they're creating beds in long-term care homes, they're creating educational opportunities, they're producing renewable energy, and the upshot of it is that these are good investments. They are at market levels of risk, they have market levels of return, they just happen to have positive externalities as opposed to negative externalities. We have a stated goal that by 2026, fully 50% of our invested assets will be in one of three categories. So impact, transition finance, resiliency investments, which again I'll come to in just a moment. That number by 2030 will need to be 60% at least. And from our perspective, the real question we have is, why can't it be so that every invested asset that we have has some positive externality in the communities that we serve? It seems to us that is just a logical outcome. I don't know how to get to 100 yet, but we've got a really good plan to get to 60, and we will go from there. So, right. So why can't we use some of these committed funds for dual purpose? Why can't an approach that gets us to net zero also protect our communities at the same time? I think we need some sort of framework for this that will allow us to measure it effectively, like we have with net. So, perhaps something that is measuring gain in resiliency as a result of a set of activities. So there's some work that needs to be done. We have a pilot project that we are about to launch, working with municipalities, so local governments in Canada, and what we would like to do through our institutional investment arm is we would like to actually use our invested assets and those of our clients when they're interested in doing so, to fund building flood resilience, to fund projects that will reduce risk in the urban forest interface, to fund reducing risk for lake, as an example. And we think we can follow the same model that has been followed with impact. It is a more complex problem, as I shared earlier. It requires more stakeholders than some of the other challenges that we've faced. But it seems like it's entirely doable. And imagine, wouldn't it be just wonderful if we were here, at some point in the relatively near future, saying that we had a significant commitment from the private sector to invest in building resiliency into the communities that we live in and serve. There was no net zero alliances not that long ago. And so I don't see any reason why there can't be similar resiliency alliances in the near future. And I'll finish on this one last point, and that is that building resiliency, especially resiliency to climate change in our communities, is actually an accelerator for reaching the Paris targets. It's actually an accelerator for hitting the net zero targets. And the reason is, if we are battling disasters, we are not going to invest in achieving those long targets. It is just human nature. We will deal with the problem that is right in front of us. And so I think it's an accelerator, it's a leverage point to help us get to the end goal when we can talk less about resilience than we do now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and also especially, when you started out, you said that if you deliver resilient infrastructure and if people see that there is less damage to infrastructure, shorter disruptions, then it begins to create social demand for it, and then case for investments become even bigger. The need for measuring gains in resiliency, how do we ensure that every investment we make has some positive externality at community level. I can see that on the platform, questions are flowing, and I hope we are able to address all of them. So the first question goes back to you, Rob. It says that, how do we de-risk investments, I guess infrastructure investments, that flow from global north to global south?
How do we de-risk the investments? Yeah, I think there's a few models that I've seen that focus on having governments or donors fund part of the risk of these projects, at least in the early stages, to attract a higher level of private capital. So those models, I think, can work. There are also models that can use insurance to essentially guarantee the performance of these infrastructure initiatives. So whatever it is that they're supposed to protect, you can actually insure the performance of them, and that's another method to de-risk from an investment perspective. What I would say, though, is that when private capital is put in play for investments like these, private capital should expect risk. There's risk in every investment, and so I think the sweet spot for us to hit is to make the investments look like market levels of risk. I don't think we don't need to do better than that. Certainly.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that. Next one I will direct to Honorable Minister. How to promote women and other groups at risk and their participation in imagining infrastructure systems in a manner that these infrastructure systems are not themselves at risk and they do not increase risk, including the conditions for gender-based violence and inequality. So how do we bring in the voice of women and other at risk in developing infrastructure in a manner that it's resilient and it does not increase risk for those things to serve?
Thank you very much. I think primarily I just want to say on issues of gender issues, it is very important that we bring up, just as I remember Dean brought the issue of bringing this into education level, so that people learn it right away from school. They get to know that it should involve both youth and also women, not necessarily a main kind of infrastructure risk. So then when we do this, all generations will grow up knowing that it's not going to be to have issues. When women are involved, it is taken like, why are they coming into these circles, so that nobody is left behind. So involvement is very, very important in this, and also bringing them together right away from planning, design, and also to the implementation of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that. Let me now turn to the resident coordinator from UAE. In your role as the resident coordinator, you're promoting net zero investment in net zero infrastructure. So the question is, of course, there's a much needed rush to build net zero assets, net zero capital.
Critical infrastructure protection. This is a good example of private-public partnership. There are all ministers, head of central office, voivodeships, critical infrastructure operators, all. So there is a platform for changing good ideas also, and to educate experts and inspire them. And also there is other issue, because this national platform lets to identify the contacts and help to organize together exercises. And also, what is the most important testing, exercise and testing before, of course, the crisis occurred. So that's why the good opportunity for this is a stress testing prepared by the UNDRR. From my perspective, the main goal is to assess resilience, capability, taking into the consideration the key indicators across the 6 capacity assessment criteria. Poland was asked to test this tool, and based on this result of 3 different multi-hazard scenarios, we could choose our sensitive areas were identified, and we could recognize potential solution for disaster prevention and resilience building. So, the most important stress test, cooperation, meeting, and solidarity also.
Thank you very much for that. Before I pose the next question that has come online, I just want to say that I don't want to not take questions from those who are physically present here, so please get your questions ready. After this next question, we'll take questions from the floor here, from those who are present physically. So there's another question for you, Rob, which says, we know that prevention costs additional money. How can these costs be absorbed with a long-term perspective in the face of short-term budget constraints?
Yeah, this is it's a great question, and this is a big challenge. I mentioned earlier that the costs of the risks that we will remove from the system through better resiliency, they often don't sit on any individual business or government's income statement or balance sheet. They're not in the budget because we manage by disaster. So the disaster occurs, and we find a way to recover afterwards. But the truth of the matter is that when we build resiliency, it's actually an investment in the future of the community from a life safety perspective, from a livelihood perspective, from an economic perspective. And those investments will pay off. The leverage, it depends on which study you look at and which type of infrastructure you're talking about. But I've seen studies that almost always say 3-to-1 leverage. So you get 3 times the benefit out of building resiliency into a project, up to as much as 10-to-1 return on doing that. the challenge is that we need to do the first ones. And I think that's where private capital can come in, especially if the return period is, is reasonably long. If there's a 10-year return period or a 20-year return period, it's often very likely that the community will have received the benefits of, of one mitigation by that time frame. And so I think we just need to collaborate. We need to cooperate. We need to work together because it's in every stakeholder in the system's interest for us to do this.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that answer. Are there any questions from the floor here?
Oh, there's a lot.
The lady here first, and then the gentleman there, and the gentleman here. If a mic could be passed on.
Thank you so much. First of all, my compliments to all the panel members for such a wonderful presentation, which was really sensitizing us towards the requirement for resilient infrastructure, if I may say so. My question is, there is already a shortage in providing the required infrastructure for the community and the people. So, and then increased emphasis on resilient infrastructure. So my question is, how do we balance this, if I may say so in very layman terms, the dichotomy of quality versus quantity? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take three questions, a set of three questions. So that question is, how do we balance the need to rapidly fill the infrastructure gap, but do it in a manner that it builds resilience? There was a second question, please.
Thank you so much, Mam Jirasakaneva. I'm from Madagascar. My question is about the application of the code or the building code that because Madagascar developed many building code and law for the water supply, road infrastructure, normal house. So the application, we have many problems because we have the cost plus cost. So between 15% until 25%. So we have, so in order to have the infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, so we need the application. So that's why I would like to ask you how to have the application, but the measure for this application. The second one is for the cost for the maintenance, because normally we receive some money from the private sector and from the partners from all the bank from European Union. But the maintenance after the government have lack of money for the maintenance. So a little bit we take this money from the petrol, but it's not enough. So that is the two problem that in Madagascar, because we try to build many infrastructure for the population, but the disaster is there, climate change is there, the lack of money is there, application of the norm and the code is also. Could you give some recommendation about it? Thank you so much.
Thank you much. Before we take the next question, because we've got a lot already on the plate, I would invite the panel to respond. I won't direct it to any specific panelists. Essentially, the two questions were quite related. About the colleague from Madagascar indicated that there are codes, there are standards. When you apply them, it costs more. In a situation where there is a large infrastructure gap, how do we attract that additional financing for investing in resilience? So it's really open to all the panelists to reflect on.
I could just, I'll just add one thing here on this point. I've been wanting to say as part of the panel, one of the things, and it relates to the question, is the fact that we all know, or we need to make aware, let's say, that investments that we make have multiple aspects to those investments, and this is what the questions were related to. And without realizing, or if our constituents don't realize, the cumulative cost, not just initial cost, then this investment is not a sustainable investment. This is why I stress the importance of the integrated approach, because without looking at all aspects of the issue, you will find yourself in a challenge. So part of the solution is, in the analytical phase of any project, they need to make sure that they're looking at it through an integrated lens to ensure that all aspects of that project can be sustainable and not just the initial phases of it. So I'll just stop at this point.
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. An integrated approach might help us address that issue.
Okay, thank you. I think that we should think in much more different areas. We can provide stress tests and, of course, workshops to be better prepared. It's very important. But on the other hand, pandemic stressed, COVID pandemic stressed, the need to move away from an object system to service system. I'm thinking of a situation where a respirator is missing one small component to function. Without device does not work. And what is the most important? Only the oxygen producer? Not everything. All process is critical. So, for example, in Europe, we have, as I mentioned before, a directive about the critical entity resilience, which will help us to implement this other approach of thinking about the critical infrastructure.
I'll add one thought. Thanks for those questions. These are very difficult choices to make. Do we build for things, understanding that they may not last very long or they may not do their job for an extended period of time, or do we build two and do so in a way that that allows them to be resilient and that they'll survive for decades or maybe perhaps survive for a century? And there's real consequences to both decisions, so I don't want to make light of that. I think there are, if we take a whole of society approach, I think we can make these choices effectively, really by thinking through the shared responsibility that the different stakeholders have. So the private sector has some responsibility for the communities that they live in and serve, and for other communities. The government does, obviously, as well. And so I think in the end, if we build to a standard that is going to give us some security, is going to ensure that that asset is going to serve its purpose, is going to be safe and resilient for the time period that's under consideration, it has a multiplying effect because the benefit from that asset will actually fund future resiliency initiatives, future projects, if the community chooses to do so. Even I think everywhere in the world we have failed because we have not built things to the standard they needed to be built to, and then they fail when disasters strike. So that's not an elegant solution, but I do believe that we need to ensure at least a minimum level of quality.
Thank you very much to the three panelists who responded to that question of making difficult choices. We have some ways of handling this by taking an integrated view of planning infrastructure systems, whole of society approach, prioritizing. One last question before we close the session, so yours, and then we'll close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal sir, for this opportunity. My question is to Her Excellency Esther ma'am from Uganda Experience. Ma'am, you mentioned about entire country, you have a physical planning act. I just wanted to know whether it is percolated to the ground zero or all the infrastructure that has been built either from the government or from the public private sector. Does they have any regulations to follow with regards to resilience infrastructure development? That's one. And second one is that we have three important frameworks internationally: Center Framework for Action, Paris Agreement, and SDG. Are they considered while formulating this act? Thank you.
So the question is, the fiscal plan, does it take into account?
Sorry, there was a reflection, an echo when you're asking the question, so I didn't get you well. But yes, we have all the three frameworks in the current act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of this session. It was an extremely rich discussion. I wouldn't try to summarize it. Just to say that after now the whole notion of disaster and climate resilient infrastructure is center stage. We now need to move beyond the rhetoric of it to actually implementing it, having a more precise understanding of what resilience in infrastructure systems means. How can this whole be underpinned by sophisticated analytics? How do we hear people's voices in this? How do we have an integrated approach so that the focus is not just on creating capital assets, but also on delivering services in a sustainable manner? Thank you very much, and it's been a great session. I thank all my panelists for engaging in this conversation. For those of us who work with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we got a lot from this, and we look forward to staying engaged with you. Thank you very much.